World Insight with Tian Wei. Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad visits China. How will Malaysia's new leader shape bilateral ties? And our exclusive interview with former Icelandic President Olafur Grimsson, where we discuss China and Iceland's cooperation over renewable energies and how the world should deal with an ever-changing America. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our show today with Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad's state visit to Beijing. The newly elected Mahathir said his visit was a chance to show the importance between Malaysia and its largest trading partner, China. Before we get down to discussion, let's take a look at this.
Malaysia's 93-year-old Prime Minister gets down to business. Chinese President Xi Jinping met with Mahathir Mohamad in Beijing on Monday. Mahathir is on a 5-day visit to China to discuss bilateral relations and regional affairs. Earlier in the morning, Premier Lee Keqiang welcomed the Malaysian leader. They also witnessed the signing of documents marking fields for cooperation.
Our two sides are willing to further expand the trade volume between China and Malaysia. Both sides hope that based on or under the condition of volume expansion, bilateral trade reaches a balance. China is willing to further increase imports of Malaysian goods that satisfy the needs of the Chinese market.
Because we are interested in solving our unemployment problem, and we feel that with Chinese investments in Malaysia, part of this problem can be resolved. So there is much to be gained by strengthening the relationship between China and Malaysia.
Mahathir earlier visited China's eastern city of Hangzhou as the first stop of his official trip, where he toured the headquarters of e-commerce giant Alibaba and auto company Geely. After assuming power in May, the Prime Minister is on a mission to attract more high-tech companies to his country and hopes to learn from China's e-commerce boom. He has met Chinese tech titan Jack Ma last Saturday.
Because we think Malaysia-China relationship is so strategically important. And we think Malaysia, so many small businesses, so many young people, they have the right, they should be using technology to sell their products to China, to the world, in a cheap, efficient, cost-effective way.
Since 2009, China has been Malaysia's largest trading partner, the largest source of foreign direct investment in manufacturing in the past 2 years, and the largest source of foreign tourists in the past 6 years. Mahathir's visit is expected to improve cooperation in development strategies and mutually beneficial initiatives.
So what can we expect from Malaysian Prime Minister's visit to China? Let's turn to our panelists. With us in our Beijing studio, Song Qingren, researcher at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. In Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, we invited Rustam Mod Isa, who is the chairman and chief executive of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Rustam Isa, obviously, this time Prime Minister is having a quite fruitful trip to China, given the fact he's interacting both with the state leaders and the private sectors.
Yes. Yes, I think it's certainly a very fruitful visit. He has had this visit to Hangzhou. He's met the business leaders over there. He's also met the business leaders in Beijing, I believe. And he's having his meeting with the state leaders. I think that speaks well for the state of bilateral relations between the two countries.
About the vitality of the two economies, the interaction with business circle is certainly a big point that people would love to hear more about. Rustam Isa, if you could be more specific about Alibaba interaction with Malaysia, that free digital trade zone, how from now on, with this trip as the foundation, likely to go on with that project?
Yes, I think with Alibaba, it is not just the digital free trade zone, but I think there are also other plans that Mr. Jack Ma has in respect of doing business with Malaysia. Now, the Prime Minister himself has said that he sees China as having big potential in terms of trade and economic relations between the two countries. Right now, we are major trading partners. Malaysia is one of the largest trading partners that China has in the developing world, certainly in ASEAN. And Malaysia sells a lot of products to China, and we buy a lot of products from China as well. So Alibaba is just one of those things. I think the Prime Minister also had some demonstrations of drone technology in Beijing, and he also visited the Geely plant in Hangzhou. So the prospects, I think, are very good for business and investment between Malaysia and China.
Right. Mr. Song, we understand the Prime Minister's visit this time. There are quite a number of beautiful surprises when it comes to business ties. He's not only visiting the drone factories and also talking to Alibaba, but at the same time getting on the speed train. So one of those things that China has been proud of over the past decade. Mr. Song, how much do you think real on-the-ground deals could be reached at this time?
Yeah, I think according to the news resources, Prime Minister Mahathir is very interested in China's several industrial fields, such as the e-commerce company, and also the car factory, and also high-speed railway, and also artificial intelligence, and also other fields such as the agricultural products cooperation, and some other cooperation in many fields. The two countries' top leaders have signed some contracts about two countries' economic cooperation. I think on the one hand, for Malaysia, it can attract more and more Chinese FDI to Malaysia, such as the Alibaba or other car factory or other infrastructure company to Malaysia, and also more and more Malaysia goods will be exported to China, because China is the biggest market for Malaysia goods. And second, I think for China companies, they will have more opportunity to explore Malaysia markets in the future.
Having said that, though, I mean, we heard before Prime Minister's meeting that he is talking to the press about relationship with China. He said Malaysia is a trading nation, Rostam Isa. He said, and therefore Malaysia would love to make our partners rich. Of course, during this process, Malaysia has also been getting richer than it used to be. We understand the BRI, for example, one of those initiatives that China and Malaysia have been working on, $20 billion from China has already been provided on the project related to BRI. How will those money be used, and how will some of the previous deals, together with some of the new inspirations, be likely translated into actions?
Yes, there are certainly some deals already made in the context of the BRI, as well as in the context of bilateral investment relations between the two countries. But the Prime Minister has also said that his government is expecting to review some of those deals to ensure that they would benefit Malaysia and the Malaysian people. And I'm sure discussions are going on between the two sides in this respect. But I think that does not mean that Malaysia and the Prime Minister is not committed to the BRI. He sees the big potential insofar as the BRI is concerned. When you mentioned that he had said that Malaysia is a trading nation, and we would like to ensure that our neighbors remain rich or become rich. That has been the policy that he adopted before when he was Prime Minister previously, which is that we should prosper our neighbors to ensure that when neighbors grow and prosper, we grow together.
Right.
We are able to develop together. We are able to trade with one another. That's the policy that he has adopted, and I'm sure he will continue with that.
Right. Right now, Rostam, is Malaysia's economy, of course, it's on its way back, but many wonder there are still challenges. According to some media reports, the debt of Malaysia has reached about $250 billion US, and also it is about the 80% of the GDP ratio. So some say that could mean quite a challenge for the Malaysian economy, while at the same time, Prime Minister's administration remains what some media called as a populist approach still. So how will those current challenges of Malaysian economy be able to interact with some of the new initiatives and thoughts of doing things, particularly related to China? Rostam Isa.
Yes. Well, I'm sure the government will be able to overcome the challenges. There are good people in the leadership. At the same time, they're getting good advice from Malaysians who have the capacity to work towards ensuring that the economy will be put on track. Yes, there is the debt that has to be dealt with, and I'm pretty sure that with the right policies coming in, this will be, we are able to deal with it. After all, yes, when we talk about debt, there are other countries that have a higher debt ratio to GDP than Malaysia. The important thing is for us to continue to ensure that foreign investment keeps coming in, that the ringgit is stabilized, and that people are prepared to do business with Malaysia. And the government is open to business, it is open to trade, and it is welcoming of both investments as well as trade opportunities coming from anywhere, including from China.
Yes. Mr. Song, how do you see the consistency in the future of the Malaysian policies once Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, of course a long-time politician in Malaysia, now coming back to power?
Yeah. I think he's a very experienced politician. I think
but also quite aged, 93 years old already.
I think experience is much more important than age. I think 1980s he led Malaysia to become a very popular, prosperous country, and now he took power again. I think he also has good ideas to lead Malaysia in the next following years. And the second, I think, according to the bilateral relations, I want to see something. Although some news said that there will be some trouble for bilateral economic cooperation, but now we see that Mahathir said that he is also friendly to China. He wants to cooperate with the BRI initiative, and also he wants to cooperate with China to push forward the globalization, to deal with the protectionism in the world trade. So I think China-Malaysia relations in the future will be very bright, the bright future.
We hope so.
Yeah.
Rostam Isa, you are a long-time observer and analyst than many of the others in your country about how the country is approaching the international picture. So may I invite also your wisdom about the governing style of Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad. I mean, he's certainly a veteran in the field for decades, dated back to the 1980s, 90s, all the way up. And at the same time, the world has been changing very fast. And there's also very different realities of where China is and where Malaysia, together with ASEAN, is today. So what do you make of, if you can, the general strategy that Prime Minister Mohamad is likely to take about Malaysia's international approach, including with big nations like China in Asia as well?
Well, one thing you have to realize that the Prime Minister is a very pragmatic man. He has pursued a very pragmatic foreign policy in the past, and I'm sure he will continue to do so from now onwards. Now, Malaysia has an important position in the region, in ASEAN as well as the Asia Pacific, and I think he will make sure that we will be able to to carry out our obligations in the international arena as a responsible nation that carries out pragmatic and friendly foreign policy. Now, he has said that in the beginning, when he became Prime Minister, he has said that we'll give emphasis to ASEAN. He would like to give emphasis to South-South cooperation, which means cooperation among the developing countries, which he championed before.
Yes.
And I'm sure he will also be pragmatic when it comes to relations with major powers like China and the United States. So I think moving forward, we would find Malaysia practicing basically the same kind of foreign policy that we found during his previous time. Of course, he is aware of changes that have occurred around the world, and I think he is very alive to that.
Rustam, one has to note his approach recently since coming back to the administration as the Prime Minister after the election. I mean, he has been quite critical of things, while at the same time quite proactive of trying to make new adjustment to the situation, including his approach to China this time. What do you make of that? Is that likely to be a strategy he's going to take toward China in the mid and the longer term? Will there be much zigzagging as we have, interestingly witnessed over the past few months? Will that be the same in the future?
Well, yes. Well, one thing I think that we need to recognize is that Dr. Mahathir is a man who speaks his mind. So there are times when it appears as if he's, talking tough, but he has always been like that. But I think he is also a man who believes that you need to be practical, you need to be pragmatic. He has said that he values friendship with China, he values the economic cooperation and trade and investment vis-a-vis China. He values China's role in the world today. So I think as we move forward, relations between Malaysia and China will continue to be strong and friendly, and I'm sure he will pursue cooperation. The fact that he has got, I think, 6 ministers with him during this visit to Beijing goes to show that he is very serious about it.
Mr. Song, from China's perspective, of course, China and Malaysia's relationship has withstood long-time challenges and also prospects. But what about for now, Mr. Song? From now on, of course, Mr. Prime Minister Mahathir has been pragmatic, as Rustam Isa has been repeatedly saying today. Well, at the same time, he's a very strong advocate of South-South cooperation, dating back to the 1990s. And he's also outspoken about the United States, about the so-called the West. Mr. Song, the world is changing, as we have seen, about how international mechanism would work, about what is the role of the United States with its more than charismatic leader in the White House, about the U.S. approach to the rest of the world, what might be the reactions and actions. So, Mr. Song, within that bigger context, how does China see today's Malaysia and Malaysia's approach, possibly working with China on some of those critical issues? Is that potential high?
Yeah. I think that on the one hand, we understand that Malaysia is a middle-sized country. He wants to make a balanced relations with China, United States, Japan, and also other big countries or organizations. So he will cooperate with many big stakeholders. And on the other hand, I think during the past several months, or even we can see that in the when Mahathir was the Prime Minister for the 20 years ago or 30 years ago, I think he is always friendly to China. I think although it's normal for two countries to have some differences when they conduct cooperation, but it's important that he is friendly to China, and now he talks with China top leaders to deal with some differences and to optimize the current cooperation. I think we will see that bilateral relations will be very good in the future.
Okay, Rustam, is the two countries have already signed the MOU. They are working on currency swap. Also, one of those ways to make sure that the world it will be much more flat with how decisions are being made, because it's about currency, about promoting currency of developing and emerging economies worldwide. Rustam, is what are some of the specifics do you think that really Malaysia and China could work together besides this beautiful picture both of you has painted?
Well, there are, of course, a number of issues that still we need to work on in respect of, say, the maritime issues. It doesn't mean that we don't have issues or problems between the two countries. I'm sure we can work it out. We can work it out in respect of ASEAN, for example, towards getting the code of conduct in the South China Sea. But I think in the larger context, we fully recognize that China is a major power. China has a very important role to play in the world, not only in respect of development, economic development and other economic related issues, but also China has an important role in peace and security. And I'm sure there are various ways that we can work together, Malaysia and China, ASEAN and China, and of course China with the other countries in the Asia Pacific and around the world.
I see. Rustam Isa, Song Qingren. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, I will speak to former Iceland President Olafur Grimsson. We will find out how Iceland went from being dependent on oil imports to becoming an exporter of renewable energy. And he's also going to share with us his wisdom about where the world is heading. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Tonight, I speak exclusively to former Icelandic President Olafur Grimsson. Iceland is a nation that progressed from being dependent on foreign oil to harnessing its natural resources to become energy efficient. The Arctic nation passing down its clean energy technology to China serves as a model of how countries can cooperate in tackling climate change. And I'm glad to be joined by the former president of Iceland, from Iceland right now, Olafur Grimsson. And Mr. President, what a pleasure to have you on World Insight with Tian Wei.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's also a great pleasure for me to be able to talk about our extensive cooperation with China.
Terrific. Let's start about the geothermal cooperation that you have managed over the years to establish with China. That's quite a big price tag, one would say $15 million US. But the question is whether a project based and designed from Iceland will be really eligible to China, with a huge population and certainly urban intensity.
Well, it really has nothing to do with the size of the population. The critical criteria is the geological nature. Unfortunately for China, you are very rich in so-called low and medium temperature geothermal resources. So this means, on the basis of the Icelandic model, as we have now already proved in over 40 cities and communities in China, you can use the local geothermal resources in China to close down the coal-driven urban heating system based on the Icelandic model. And we have now over 10 years of bringing the Icelandic model to China, and it is already an extraordinarily successful addition to the clean energy, non-polluted, sustainable future of Chinese cities.
Right. Climate change issue is something that China and Iceland can work on together. However, many say that issue has been losing steam because of the U.S. withdrawal. What do you make of it, Mr. President? I know you work very hard throughout the decades on that cause.
Well, I have been working for decades on the climate issue, and some years ago I founded the Arctic Circle, which is the largest annual international gathering on the Arctic. Takes place here in Iceland every October. And the Arctic is, as you know, the front line of climate change. And despite the decision by the new American administration, the global cooperation on the climate is growing in a very strong way. And there I think China has shown extraordinary leadership in recent years, both in terms of your clean energy transformation in solar, wind, electric cars, as well as the geothermal projects we mentioned before. So although Washington has withdrawn, both European countries, Asian countries led by China and others, including also most of the big cities in the world and major corporations, have now realized that we have to cooperate very strongly in this area.
But Mr. President, many around the world would say that is very unfair because one country can just withdraw and therefore not responsible at all for its actions, and the actions it conducted earlier throughout the Industrial Revolution. Many wonder what kind of precedence is that setting for international mechanism, not only climate change, but also many other issues.
Well, the fact of the matter is that the United States is a complicated country, and you have many states within the Union, including California, for example, which will host next month a very impressive climate meeting. You have a multitude of cities in the United States, as many of the big companies like Google, Walmart, and many others, Apple and others, who have decided to adhere to the climate Paris Agreement. So paradoxically, despite the decision by Donald Trump, the United States, through the combined effort of the states and the cities and the companies, might indeed meet the target set by Paris. But irrespective of that, the forces of clean energy transformation all over the world, as well as the realization that whoever has caused the pollution, the melting of the ice in my part of the world, the melting of the ice in the Himalayan Tibetan plateau, the melting of the ice in Antarctica, is affecting every country in the world and every continent.
But Mr. President, one has to be frank about the reality. The reality is some countries might want to withdraw from the climate change agreement. However, the countries that withdraw from that agreement are extremely interested in the interest that they could get from developing so-called the Arctic Circle. So you see quite an interesting mixture of attitude on the one hand about responsibility and benefits, but on the other hand total benefits itself. What do you make of that?
Well, fortunately, the world is not as simple as that. For example, if you take the Arctic cooperation, despite the conflicts between Russia and the United States in various other parts of the world, including Ukraine, Syria, and other areas, within the Arctic in recent years, the United States and Russia have, together with us, the other Arctic state, cooperated very constructively. You're also seeing China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, India, the leading Asian powers coming into the Arctic cooperation in a very strong way. You are seeing in the last 10 years monumental transformation in solar, wind, geothermal and other forms of clean energy, where China has now become a very strong leader. So even if some political leaders decide to turn against an international agreement, We fortunately live in a world where individual states and cities and companies can continue responsible actions and policies despite the political leadership. That is why the governor of California, together with other American partners, will in a few weeks' time host a very important climate summit in California. And what is also new in this dynamic situation is that China is now exerting a stronger leadership in this area than anybody could have expected. When I was in China a few weeks ago and attended the Eco Forum Global meeting, the concept of eco-civilization was launched by the Chinese leadership, which is a very important addition to this global dialogue.
Well, Mr. President, as you may know, besides climate change issues, there are a lot of issues that China and Iceland have been working together. Actually, China is one of the biggest, in fact, the biggest trading partner of Iceland. It is also the origin country of the majority of Asian tourists going to Iceland. Besides that, there's also shipbuilding, telecommunication, finance, Arctic affairs that the two countries have been working on together. But the question is, where is the direction of this cooperation? I mean, from economic and trade cooperation moving up the ladder to further strategic cooperation. Is it happening?
Well, this is a fascinating question because, as I told you before, when I became president in 1996, China and cooperation with China was hardly on our radar screen. So in just 20 years throughout my presidency, we saw all these new areas of cooperation with China evolve. Iceland, for example, was the first country in Europe with which China did a free trade agreement.
That's right.
So in many ways, I think what we are doing is paving the way for constructive cooperation that others can then follow. Chinese tourists, especially young Chinese people, I believe, will continue to come to Iceland because when they come here, they discover a pollution-free city. They discover a clean energy country. They discover an extraordinary nature, but they also discover a peaceful, non-violent country where you can go freely anywhere and where even the president and the ministers have no security service whatsoever.
Yes.
With respect to the Arctic, which is a big part of the planet and increasingly a crucial part, both in environmental terms, scientific terms, but also economic terms, China and Iceland have become very strong partners. My organization, Arctic Circle, will organize next May an Arctic Circle forum in Beijing on China and the Arctic. And the Chinese Polar Institute is establishing a new observatory scientific station to look at the universe in Iceland, which will be inaugurated this year.
There are other issues I would love to invite your wisdom. What about the international trade rules? WTO very much under the threat by some unilateral actions of certain countries using domestic law to judge some of the international and bilateral trade issues. And therefore, people wonder what is next step for WTO. Meanwhile, the complementary process of making sure that the international system, the UN, the World Bank, IMF, are keeping up with the time are also not resolved. So we have a lot on hand. What about that? Where to start with? Will countries really have this consensus, Mr. President?
Well, on the trade issue, I think we have to distinguish between what is the noise coming out of Washington and the White House. Noise meaning the media interventions and the declarations. And what is reality? We saw all these statements 2 months ago or so between the White House and the European Union, and then a few weeks ago we saw the head of the Commission and the President kissing in relation to their press conference in Washington. We have also seen a lot of statements on the trade relations between China and the United States, but the negotiations are still going on. So I think in this world of modern media politics and Twitter and instant television and everything else, where political campaigns are no longer restricted to a few months before the election, but continue every day of every year, we have to be very careful to distinguish what I call the noise in the forms of the statements and propaganda, and what then turns out to be the eventual reality. And I think we still have to wait to see what will become the individual reality with respect to the trade. What is the American president doing in order to peace his constituency in the United States, or what is the reality? On the international institutions you mentioned, the IMF, the World Bank and so on, the fact of the matter is these institutions were created on the basis, as you know, of the power structure that emerged after the Second World War. We are now seeing in the last few years, for example, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank being created not only in China, but with the participation of my own country, most European countries and others, at the same time as the G7 meeting took place in Quebec with all the drama that was reported by the Western media.
Right.
The Shanghai Cooperation Organization had a remarkable summit in China with the President of China, the Prime Minister of India, the President of Russia, the President of Iraq, and many others coming together representing 40% of mankind and 20% of the global economy. So we are seeing the emergence of new structures that I believe will find their way to coexist with the World Bank and the IMF. And the fact of the matter is that the countries that were the most powerful elements in the United Nations in the decades following the Second World War no longer in the 21st century play the same role, and the UN system has to adjust to that.
Mr. President, I want to follow up on some of the crucial points you were making. You were suggesting that not only on the surface that people should look at when it comes to these geopolitical debates, but rather the real texture under the surface, the real actions in the water, what exactly is happening. But one also want to argue, Mr. President, what is observed on the surface, of course, could be just superficial, but at the same time, it could also be suggesting to us where the direction countries involved are heading for. That certainly could give us some hint, not just the believing in the traditional way of doing things. Mr. President, I hope you understand what I'm talking about.
No, I do very much. If we go back 3 years, I didn't know anybody who believed Donald Trump could become President of the United States except my wife, who continuously said he had a good chance and was opposed by almost everybody at every lunch and dinner that we had in any other part of the world. And quite frankly, I don't think anybody can predict what the political situation will be in the United States in 3 or 4 years' time. As I said before, the prevailing consensus that guided the United States both internally and externally for almost the entire second half of the 20th century is no longer there. And this, I don't think it will ever return. So the rest of us in Europe, in Asia and elsewhere will have to find a new way to deal with the world, in cooperation also with countries in Africa and Latin America. And that is why I find the contrast between the G7 summit in Quebec and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in China so revealing in terms of this transformation that is taking place in the world.
Mr. President, before we go, one final and brief question for you. Are we going to take a long time to make that turn, which you have been suggesting, as the world is changing, in order to let the international system to catch up? Or we are already, Mr. President, at that critical juncture and things are likely to happen and happen fast, Mr. President?
Well, I think they will happen fast, and I, being an optimist, believe they will move in a constructive way. If we look at what has happened in the relationship between my country and China in the last 10 years, if we look at the different position that China has now in multiple areas in the world, if we look at the progress that has been made in clean energy in the last 10 years, if we look at the transformation that information technology and the internet has brought about, if we look at the transformation in medical science, we see in all these areas extraordinary capability of people, communities, and nations. And I would not have stayed president for 20 years if I was not an optimist. And I think if my presidency was a success, it was also because I did not let the noise disturb my determination to let action produce real constructive changes, both for my country and the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. With that words of wisdom, we are wrapping up today's conversation with you. Really appreciate Mr. President coming from Iceland, the former President of Iceland, Olafur Grimsson. Thank you, sir, for being with us. All the best to you.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, with your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From Tian Wei and everyone on World Insight, thanks for being with us, and bye for now.